Welcome to EidelOctober. All through this month, I plan on releasing videos on topics surrounding the dead, hero cults, magic, and other spooky things. Though it is worth noting that the primary holidays associated with the dead happened months ago in August and February, respectively, this solar year. Ancestor worship is a topic I've been asked about many times. How did it work? Did people honor adopted parents and grandparents? Let's take a look. Kairete. Ancestor veneration is a core component of many faiths, from heathenry to Kemetic practice to, yes, Hellenism, though when one would honor the ancestors and how often varied depending on the era. Even how gets murky depending on your social class. Because I primarily look to Athens for my reconstruction, and because we have the most evidence from Ithaca regarding practice, this is the area of Greece that I'll be focusing on primarily for this video. Before we get into ancestor worship, it's important to take a look at the burial process and ceremonies surrounding it. According to Robert Garland in The Greek Way of Death, Greek death was not so much a specific instantaneous event as it was a process, involving 3 distinct phases for the person passing. Phase 1 was dying. Phase 2 was dead but uninterred, and Phase 3 was dead and interred. As we saw from the Odyssey, a person who does not receive burial rites was considered unable to enter Hades in the Archaic and early Classical periods, though as I mentioned in my video about the Homeric afterlife, there were many competing ideas about the afterlife throughout Greek history. One thing that remains consistent, however, is that it was the duty of the immediate family to bury the one passed in any case but that of a temple robber or murderer. This was such an important task that, according to Richard Seaford in Reciprocity and Ritual, sons could be disinherited from their estates if they didn't see to proper funerary rites or continue cultic honoring of the deceased afterward. After Solon passed several laws limiting the size, scope, and length of burial rites, it became clear, according to Seaford, how closely linked the right and duty to mourn and honor were to the right to inheritance. This is so important that often childless men would adopt sons specifically to ensure burial and remembrance, as well as continuation of their family line. These adoptees would continue to offer at the tomb just as bloodkin would. In ancient Athens, a legal adoption was also a ceremonial one, and one's blood was considered changed. In other words, yes, modern Hellenists should honor those who adopted them or their parents if they feel close to those folks and desire to do so. There's actually precedent in history for that. The duty to prosecute murderers also fell on closest kin, and I may do a video sometime in the future about how that responsibility nearly led to a collapse of Athens due to reciprocal revenge killing brought on by funerary dirges sung by women. Funerals were really political back then, even more so than today. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. Not burying one's kin was also one of the few sources of agos, or divine wrath, particularly from the underworld gods. So it's impossible to understate its importance, which leads to the question, what were funerary rites like? The process started well before the person passed, at least in the case of those who knew their passing was coming, such as the terminally ill, injured, condemned for crimes, and those of exceedingly old age. From several literary sources, including Socrates in the Dialogues and Oedipus from Oedipus Colonos, Garland derives 6 commonalities regarding pre-death preparation. 1. A funerary bath, cleansing the soon-to-pass, especially in river water. 2. The committal of one's children to the safe care of others. 3. The settling of one's legal affairs and debts. 4. A prayer to Hestia to take care of one's loved ones. 5. A prayer for safe passage to Hades. And 6. A farewell to family and friends. This farewell was often shared until the moment of death with one's closest kin, as Garland points out was typical in most ancient societies. Our modern idea of dying alone in a hospital bed with only medical attendants was not the case for the majority of history. Death was a familial affair, even before it fully took the person in question. The hearth fire would also be considered polluted, and water would be brought from a nearby home and placed in the front of the door for folks who were unrelated but visiting the family to purify themselves after they left. The eyes and mouth would be closed by the next of kin, which according to 3rd century inscriptions may have been to release the psyche, or the soul, from the body to Hades. Contrary to popular belief, coins were not actually placed in the mouths of corpses until well into the Hellenistic period. The concept of paying the fare to Charon was a later invention, as was the idea of Hermes Sucopompos guiding the soul to the afterlife, though Hermes was far earlier than the fare idea and appears to date back to the 6th or 7th century BCE. A pillow would be placed beneath the corpse's head to prevent the mouth from sagging open, and the women of the house would wash and anoint the body while weeping and sometimes singing. Seawater was preferred for this if it were available, and particular care would be taken, according to Garland, with the bodies of veterans. If there were open wounds, they would be dressed and cleaned at this stage. When finished, the corpse would be laid out on a funerary bed, which in later antiquity was closer to a couch, and dressed in either an ankle-length white garment or a white-gray funerary shroud. The feet would always face the door, which was noted in several places in Homer and therefore was likely an ancient custom. Unmarried or recently married dead were often put in wedding attire rather than the traditional shroud, and young girls of this sort were sometimes referred to as brides of Hyades. This wasn't considered a literal marriage to the god, but rather a gift to the deceased that they would find a husband in the land of the dead, as was denied them in life. A crown would be placed on the head of any corpse, sometimes a wreath for poorer folks, or gold for the aristocracy. There are few attestations for why this was, though Garland notes that crowns and wreaths were used at many sacred occasions in ancient Greek religion. The laying out period, or prosthesis, would last for several days until the 4th century, when Solon's laws limited to a mere 1 day after passing. During this time, women would crowd around the head of the bier. The person's wife or closest female kin would support the head of the corpse, while other women would tear out their hair and weep, often touching the corpse but rarely if ever embracing it. Men would circle the bier with their hands on the hilt of their swords, sometimes hitting their heads, but they were never portrayed as tearing out their hair. There are also terms used to refer to prostheses that talk of, quote, beating one's chest, implying that this was also a symbol of mourning. As I mentioned before, funerals were quite political. Until Solon's laws passed, the more powerful and rich you were, the more folks would turn out to your funeral, and the bigger a spectacle it often was. The force of a woman's lament was also said to be an early warning not to go after that particular family, as the people very much cared for one another, and if foul play was suspected, you would definitely be gone after. A gos, or ritualized funerary dirge, was sung by the closest kin, particularly women. It would often celebrate the life and accomplishments of the deceased, much as the speeches given at wakes and funerals in the modern days do, but would also call for revenge if foul play was suspected. This dirge satisfied two main functions according to Garland. The first was to appease the soul of the deceased and ease their passing into Hyades, assured that they would be remembered by loved ones who missed them and that if foul play happened, the culprit would be found. The second was to ensure that mourners had an outlet for their grief and that life could return to normal quickly after the funeral. Death brought miasma after all. Eventually, the forcefulness of these dirges led to more laws by Solon regarding the location of prostheses, moving it from outside the home to inside and limiting the people who could participate. It also eventually led to the creation of a private festival, Genesia, where families could visit tombs and honor the dead all in one day as a city-state rather than on the anniversary of death as was customary prior. The next stage was the Igbora, or carrying out. The few depictions we have of the carrying out show bodies carried on a horse-drawn hearse, though Garland notes that this may not be typical because of the expense and the fact that the hearse may have been more interesting artistically than a group carrying a body on a bier. In the early periods, this carrying out would happen during the day, and offerings would be made to Hyades before it started. Men would head the procession, and women would follow behind, and stops would be made on several street corners to attract the maximum amount of public attention allowed. Spoilsport that he was, Solon restricted this to after sunset, close living relatives only, and restricted which streets could be used with the carrying out going forward. He also made it illegal to stop on street corners and said that you had to go straight to the grave. Pallbearers would then take the body to the grave. Prior to the 4th century, these would usually be close family, but post-4th century they would have been hired. Musicians would play at the graveside while the body was buried or burned, a type of music referred to by Garland as Carian music. Cremation and inhumation were about equal until the 4th century, though in epic and tragedy, cremation was often the only method used. There are a few examples of inhumation and tragedy, but in Homer, cremation and burial were synonymous. Though Garland does note that embalming wasn't entirely absent from archaic-era grave sites. It was just very rare. By the Hellenistic period, inhumation predominated, which makes sense when one looks at the syncretism between Hellenic, Roman, and Egyptian burial rites of the time. You can't tell me that a group of people that built the pyramids and the massive, beautiful tombs, when they mix with another group of people, wouldn't have some level of influence on wanting beautiful tombs. Offerings were poured over the body at the deposition: milk, honey, wine, oil, and sometimes flowers. These are the same koi that are offered later in the year when trying to contact the dead for advice or simply to honor them on the yearly anniversary of the grave, or Genesia. A funerary trench would be dug between 2 and 12 meters long, and offerings would be deposited in baskets and amphorae and set alight or buried. These consist of cakes, honey, wine, eggs, and sometimes seashell and birds. In later antiquity, sometimes the horses used for the hearse would also be killed and offered, though only for extraordinary heroic funerals. If the deceased was cremated, wine would be used to quench the flames when the body was consumed, and the ashes would be gathered into a funerary urn. Offerings would be given on the 3rd, 9th, and 30th days after death. After that, visitations become a lot more scattered depending on the period in history. Immediately following the burial, a feast would be held at the family's home, and 3 days later, after offerings were presented, ritual bathing in the hearth would be relit from a neighbor's home. Prior to Solon's restrictions and the creation of Genesia, it was customary for visitation to happen on the anniversary of death by the women and son left behind. Raw eggs, honey, wine, milk, water, and oil would be offered at the tomb and poured as koes, or libations after which nothing could remain for the living. It was considered wrong to consume the offerings for the dead, an offense to them and the gods. Even after Solon created Genesia, which happened on the 5th of Bodremion every year, tragedy shows that family members would still make at least semi-frequent visits to gravesites to leave offerings. Sometimes honey cakes and other cooked food would accompany the libations, though blood sacrifices appear to be very rare after the 6th century. According to Simon Pulleyn in Prayer and Greek Religion, these visits would start with prayer and offerings to underworld deities. Which chthonic aspects would be invoked varied by the time period. Persephone and Hyades were invoked in Homer with prayers to release the soul of Tiresias, and in later tragedies, Hermes Sucopompos and Gaia Chthoniia filled this function. Then, offerings and prayers would proceed in much the same fashion, directed toward the deceased, as I outlined in my video on prayer. 3 parts: invocation, argument, and request, though the argument and request phases would be far more personal, as one would hope those close to the deceased would know much about them. Decorations would also be hung or wreathed about the stele, or grave marker. Scholars aren't quite sure why, but it appears to be a form of votive offering. The dead were notoriously grumpy given the not the best condition of being stuck in the dark all the time, so it makes sense that votive offerings would help appease them. Some evidence from tragedy suggests that these offerings would be given before weddings, sometime after birth, and at times when the family needed advice they felt the relative could give. Solon's restrictions heavily imply that tomb visits were frequent enough to warrant concern for the stability of the polis, considering how they strengthened familial ties over those to the city-state. For those whose families were too poor to go for grave sites, or who lost their relatives in war, Nekiomanteia, or oracles of the dead, were available. These were labyrinthine buildings that wound through the underworld, with special sites to deposit votive offerings along the way. It was said that the spirit of the deceased would manifest at the end to give one advice, though if you lingered too long, Persephone would send up the head of Medusa to scare you off. In the modern day, many Hellenists honor their ancestors and the ancestors of faith on the last day of the lunar month, known as Hecate's Deipnon. Traditionally, the ancients would leave a meal at the crossroads for Hecate and the restless dead that followed her. These meals would not be consumed, as it was considered to be offensive to her and the dead. Many modern Hellenists add the ancestor cult to this rite, dedicating the meal to both Hecate and the ancestors, though some only celebrate on Genesia or on the anniversary of their family's deaths. If you cannot visit a grave to leave offerings, it's best to bury them outside or wrap them separately from the trash. It may also be a good idea to have a separate shrine, if space permits, for these rites or to perform them outside. The dead are miasmic, after all. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, leave offerings to the subscribe button and ring the notification bell that Hermes Sucopompos may guide new videos to your inboxy tweak. Drop down into the comments and tell me about your ancestor rites, or accuse me of worshipping demons if that's your speed. Special thanks to GaelicNox for the channel art. As always, links are in the description below to their Twitter and website, and special thanks to my patrons. A number of those books were expensive to track down and difficult to get. I wouldn't be able to afford the work that I do without you all. Congratulations to Ninja Mode 67 for winning this week's Patreon bonus drawing. Last month's bonus video should be out for you pretty soon for folks who aren't patrons. Link in the description if you're interested in helping out the channel. And remember, we're stronger together.